So could this be a strategy for them to retreat
Buy
and then,
time,
yeah, and then equip
revamp,
themselves and then attack again?
One possibility. And if I were to look at it tactically, at a point I know you are actually blindsided. At a point I know you are actually disadvantaged. If you called for a ceasefire, I should be given conditions. But then, we have not heard of any conditions from either side.
Because even though it's well over 48 hours, the matter is still developing. In some of today's papers, they say negotiations are continuing.
Negotiations will be continuous. Ceasefire, amnesty, dialogue, they are all what you can call byproducts of negotiation. So negotiations will continue. But a ceasefire is not a surrender. A ceasefire could even be 10 minutes. It all depends on who the disputants are. And depending on what you do to fine-tune it, it is vulnerable to what? Sabotage. It is vulnerable to what? Mischief makers. Because people jump on the Boko Haram boss. People make money from this Boko Haram situation on both sides.
Because when they say negotiations continue, the fear here is that for this week, it's supposed to dovetail or specifically be on just one agenda, the release of the Chibok girls. And within 24 hours of that ceasefire, well, we saw what finally happened. Is this likely to jeopardize this whole discussion that we're likely to continue this week, which is about the release of the Chibok girls?
That is absolutely up to the federal government. That will depend on what I want to call negotiation skills now. That will depend on who the disputants are. In this case, whether we're talking of the Shekau that has already been declared dead, or we're talking of this Ahmadu Danladi that we don't know to have anything to do with the Boko Haram ab initio. He is just a new name, absolutely. Now, depending on what goes on and your position, that will predetermine whether you can actually come out and ask for those girls. That will determine whether we make or mar the release of those girls. But I can tell you one thing for a fact. Wherever those girls are, they are actually being held as what I can call a collateral. They are actually being held as what I can call a screen, a safety screen.
So can they release those girls, release their collateral or their safety screen?
That will depend on the negotiation position of the federal government. What are you bringing to the table? What are we getting for releasing them?
So it may likely be an exchange.
An exchange is likely if we cross our T's and dot our I's. The ceasefire negotiation was not well fine-tuned. And you can see somehow, it could be the Boko Haram, it could be sabotage. We have seen an attack.
Let me bring this in now, because now you've touched on something that we also must look at. If truly we have Boko Haram that has agreed with the government on a ceasefire, and they also assured the nation that the Chibok girls are safe and well, that they will release them. So we're looking at a possible release for the week. Is it likely that we have three kinds of Boko Haram? A criminal gang arm and a disgruntled arm that is saying, wait a minute, why the ceasefire? This is not what we wanted. And they try to unleash mayhem. And maybe thirdly, the real Boko Haram. What can the government and the military do in this regard, now that we know, if that is true, that there is another arm of Boko Haram that is not with the real Boko Haram and they decide to unleash mayhem on the people? If the military say there is a ceasefire and your commander has said no more, what happens in this case when people attack you?
Beautiful. The decision or the announcement by the Chief of Defense Staff, when I read about it and heard about it, I thought aloud to myself, if people do not have a history of respecting agreements, and we have an agreement now, I would not stand my troops down. Let me tell you how I would have done it if I was in position. I would have come out and placed myself in a position that whichever way it tends, I will still have the upper hand. And I'll simply have said, negotiations to reach a ceasefire with the Boko Haram are in top gear. They have given us indicators that they are open to a ceasefire, and we welcome it wholeheartedly. Whenever they make that ceasefire, we will accept it. And you just...
Shouldn't we also be demanding they surrender all their weapons and arms and ammunition?
Well, that I told you would have been a subject of the agreements they have reached on the table. But as I told you again, if I was in position and I was going into a negotiation with the upper hand, having raked in all the feats the army did in the last 3-4 weeks, then I'll be coming to that negotiation table with some measure of authority too, despite the fact that the girls are still with them.
What about psychologically? Does this suggest to us that we've got their back against the wall?
Yes, because I'll tell you something. That individual, Ahmadu Danladi, I'm still trying to see what I can dig up about him, but he doesn't really fit. As I speak to you right now, the Shekau I know is a deep-seated egoist. Shekau is not the kind of person that will hide or run. If you see the nature of his operations, he's a choleric, let me put it that way. He is bloodthirsty. He means business. And at least up from the first time one Lieutenant Colonel Sagir announced that Shekau was dead, we have actually seen a situation where today we hear he's alive, tomorrow we hear he's not alive. Let's assume he was alive. So why the proxy? Who will Shekau hide from? Who has found him anyway?
And in fact, what do they mean? Because when the story came that this had the blessing of Shekau.
Exactly.
And people thought,
exactly. So which Shekau? Which Shekau are we talking about? We've just said that one has been killed. He was proxy to the first one who has been done away with. And then we now have, it has the blessings of Shekau. So I'm looking at a situation where you are looking at some form of what I call deception here. And it falls on our intelligence agencies to actually fine-tune what they have on ground. You see, intelligence doesn't necessarily mean you have to go and find Shekau where he is. But if you keep data and you start drawing lines to concatenate events as they occur, at a point you are going to see a trend. Okay, you're going to see a trend because right from the beginning, when I had Idris Deby was like brokering this ceasefire, I went back to my records and I saw Idris Deby's armed forces, the Cameroonian armed forces, the Nigerian armed forces, the Nigerian armed forces are actually a coalition of armed forces that are battling these people. And I looked at the kind of person I know called Shekau. Would he probably even look at the owner of one of the forces that battled him as a mediator in Chad? So we have to do a lot of what you call subtleties. You have to look at those little things that don't seem to matter and begin to see a trend. The ceasefire process was welcomed by everybody, but I think it wasn't properly fine-tuned. There were certain T's that were not crossed and certain I's that were not dotted. Yes, I'll leave it at that.
All right, that's where we'll have to end it, but we'll continue discussion in just a moment. We've got another perspective coming up. But thank you, Captain Aliyu.
You're welcome.
This morning.
You're
We'll be back
most
after
welcome.
this. Don't go away.